Welcome to this video which looks at what a TEE table looks like, and we'll be focusing on the play Macbeth by William Shakespeare. So let's start with what does a TEET table look like. Now at this point I just want to say most people don't do this last theme column. I like to have it and I'll show you why, but if you've learned a TEE table, that's fine. I just like to add theme and I'll show you in a second. So when we come to, let's go to the first example. So we'll say that Shakespeare uses the technique of personification. In the example, my keen knife see not the wound it makes. This is Lady Macbeth talking when she's talking about when she was this is Lady Macbeth talking when she was praying to the demons to come and take away her sex or take away her gender so that she didn't feel feminine and that she wouldn't feel guilt about what she's doing to Duncan about killing him. So if we look at the effect, it separates Lady Macbeth from the violence she will commit, and it shows that she's actually a very weak person because she isn't convinced of what she's doing and she feels guilt regardless of how she portrays herself to Macbeth. She's actually not happy about it. Now, most students, what they do is when it comes to the effect, they will sort of repeat here. I tell my students, cover example. If you need to, cover it with your hands. And make sure that you remember that the effect is talking about the effect of the technique. So what does personification do? In this instance, personification separates her from the violence because it's the knife that's stabbing, not her. Okay, my keen knife sees not. The fact that the knife is alive and is personified means that the knife is the one killing, not her. This really shows her mental state at this point, that she's not ready to take responsibility for what she is doing. Now, the theme I've left open for you, but I'd probably put masculinity or femininity, which is the theme that we're going to talk about in the next example, but that's, you can put it for here as well. So the next technique that we're going to be looking at is emotive language and juxtaposition. Many times the same passage or even the same sentence will use more than one technique. I would suggest that you don't just choose one. You can talk about how the composer has used multiple techniques in that one example. So here, the emotive language and juxtaposition in I have given suck and know how tender it is to love the baby that milks me. I would, while it was smiling in my face, have plucked my nipple from his boneless gums and dashed the brains out had I sworn as you have done this. So again, if we're looking at emotive language and juxtaposition, what's the effect of that? Don't ever do this. Lots of students do this. When it comes to effect, they'll just say, here Lady Macbeth talks about how she has given breastfeeding to a child, blah, 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 blah. You don't want this. You want to talk about what is the effect of juxtaposition, what is the effect of emotive language. And the effect is to characterize Lady Macbeth as violent, and the effect is to stir the emotions of the responder against Lady Macbeth, and it highlights her evil. So all of these things are what Shakespeare had in mind when he chose the emotive language, or when he chose to juxtapose this innocent baby and her violence. Okay, that adds to the shock and horror that people who are watching this play, the responders, are feeling when Shakespeare has used such language. If he just said, I'd kill a baby, people would be like, oh, she's horrible, but they wouldn't feel that same shock and horror and be as emotional as when he's used these techniques. And here again, you can talk about masculinity and femininity. You could talk about whatever theme you think really comes out of there. But I mean, in the context that this line was set in, she was highlighting that he is not acting like a man, and that even though she's supposed to be a mother, she's supposed to be maternal, she still has more strength, the way that she sees it, than he does. So this is really interesting how Shakespeare's done this. Now, I would not just talk about this next part as the motif of the dagger. A motif is just a symbol that's repeated throughout the text. So any symbol that's repeated multiple times in any text is called a motif. It's not just one symbol like that's just used once. It's used throughout the text. So throughout Macbeth, we know that there is a motif of a dagger. A dagger is just a knife that was used back in the olden days. But what's interesting here is that Shakespeare also uses a metaphor, because that's what a motif is. It's just a symbol, and a metaphor is symbolic for something. Also, it's foreshadowing. So anytime in a play or any text when they sort of tell the future of what's happening, not as a prophecy, but they sort of give hints to the reader or to the audience or whatever about what's going to happen, that's called foreshadowing. So in the line, "Is this a dagger which I see before me?" the motif of daggers symbolizes the violence which has overtaken Macbeth. Okay, and here the theme would be violence, which is obviously a very big theme in the play. So here you would say, you know, Shakespeare uses the metaphor of the motif of the dagger, as well as foreshadowing in the example, "Is this a dagger which I see before me?" The motif of the dagger symbolizes the violence which has overtaken Macbeth, to explore the theme of violence. So basically, when you come to use your TEET table, you just go from left to right and you just make your sentences based on the table that you have written. That is the most easiest way to do this. So the next motif, oh, this is really annoying, isn't it? The motif of light and darkness. And this is, again, a symbol that Shakespeare repeats throughout the play. And here I've got several, because I want to show you how to actually use motifs. The best way to use motifs is to use more than one example to show how something is symbolized throughout the play. So this line is taken from Macbeth, when he says, "Stars, hide your fires, and let not light see my black and deep desires." So he's personified light, and he said he doesn't want light to see his black and deep desires. So there is a bit of a juxtaposition between light and black. And Benko here says, "The instruments of darkness tell us truths." He's talking about the witches and how at times what they've said is correct. So he calls here the witches the instruments of darkness. Again, there's that sort of light and dark. This is a very interesting line from Lady Macbeth's maid. She says she has light by her continually, 'tis her command. She becomes afraid of the dark to the point where she asks for a light to be with her continually. So here Shakespeare is using the motif of light and the motif of darkness to explore, you know, the theme of, for example, good and evil. It is as simple as that good is represented by light, evil is represented by darkness or by blackness. And that is why he's chosen to use the motif to explore that. The effect. Anytime you see motif, anytime you see symbolism, anytime you see a metaphor symbolize something. So it symbolizes, you know, the difference or the contrast, it's probably a better word, of good and evil. And you can talk more about that because that's where your marks will come. It's by that discussion that you will have in what is the effect of this, and discuss how light and darkness are presented in Macbeth. Another motif is the hands and hyperbole. This is probably my favorite part of the whole TE table. So Macbeth says, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas in ink, whatever, making the green one red." So he's basically saying, if you used all the oceans in the world to wash his hands, instead of making his hands clean, the blood on his hands will make all the oceans red. So here the motif of hands symbolizes actions. And I'm not going to go into detail because I've shown you an example of how you would look at a paragraph, or how you would write a paragraph. Down the bottom, we're going to go through it. So just so you know, the motif of hands, hyperbole just means exaggeration. It's the technical term in English for exaggeration. So he uses the exaggeration that all the waters of the world couldn't wash his hands. And similarly, his wife says, "He's the smell of the blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand." So she's saying, nothing can take away the stench of blood that's on her hands, and we will talk more about that in depth. So we'll just leave that for now. We'll go on to the next quote. So the technique is motif of hallucinations, and you can see, "Is this a dagger I see before me?" And Lady Macbeth hallucinates that her hands are filled with blood. Um, the motif of hallucination symbolizes, so again, we want the word symbolizes because that's what the effect of motif is always going to be. Repetition, for example, is always to emphasize. You need to know what techniques have what effect. I might do a video about that if you would like in the future, but just so you know, that is what we mean by the effect part. So the motif of hallucination symbolizes the distortion of reality and the mind, and the theme is truth versus deception. If you can't tell the difference between the reality and hallucinations, it's symbolic of the fact that truth and deception have sort of merged in this play, and nobody knows what's truth anymore. That's why as well Shakespeare has chosen this symbolism of hallucinations to explore this theme. The motif of sleep. Now, obviously, you don't want your essay to be, just a bunch of motifs, but it's just an example of what you can use. Wicked dreams abuse the curtained sleep. So he's got, this is Macbeth talking about how dreams are personified and he can't sleep. He knows that the dreams are so bad that they're not going to be happening anymore. And he continues this later when he says, "Better be with the dead whom we to gain our peace have sent to peace." So he is almost proud of the fact that he sent Duncan to peace because Duncan now sleeps. And he says that on the torture of the mind to lie in restless ecstasy, Duncan is in his grave after life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. He's actually jealous of Duncan. He's jealous because Duncan is sleeping and Macbeth is not, because he's tortured by his bad dreams. He's tortured by his feelings of guilt and remorse at what he's done. So again, what are you going to be doing for here? What do you think the effect is? It's a motif, so we know it's a symbol, so it's always going to symbolize. And what is it symbolizing? It's symbolizing his guilt. Okay, so here you'd write symbolizes guilt. And that's the effect. And then you'd, talk about remorse and guilt and everything else in the theme, and you just explore this idea in greater detail. That's really what your essay should be about. So finally we come to how to actually use a TEE table to write down a paragraph, which is obviously the most important part of using the TET table.
So here I've just taken exactly what I've got for the Motif of Hands row, and I've made a paragraph out of it. So I've said Shakespeare utilizes the motif of hands to symbolize deeds and highlight the guilt felt by Macbeth and his wife. I just made that up, quickly on the spot to give you an example, but what you want is you are trying to answer whatever question you've been given, and on the inference that this essay question was asking me about how Macbeth and Lady Macbeth felt about the murders, I'm going to argue that they felt guilt, okay? So I've said Shakespeare combines the motif of hands with hyperbole in the line, will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my hand will rather, etc. You don't need to write all of it. You only need to write really the first part of it. I'm just giving you an example. To symbolize the magnitude of Macbeth's crime and exemplify Macbeth's remorse. Whoa, okay, that's wrong. That's annoying me, so I'm just going to fix that. These techniques are repeated in Lady Macbeth's Here's the Smells of the Blood Still, or the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. Shakespeare juxtaposes the great quantity of all the perfumes of Arabia and her little hand, similar to all the great Neptune's waters with his hand, yet in both instances the blood on their hands outweigh the greatest quantities of water and perfume. You can talk a little bit more about, the idea that they'll never get rid of this blood that's tainted them. Obviously, it's not about their physical hand, it's about the symbolism of their deeds have now been tainted by this innocent blood which they've shed. And this reflects the great remorse Macbeth and his wife feel. That's not a great paragraph, but it is an example of how to use a TEET table to answer a question. You would do this with every quote that you think is important. You'd hopefully do this in every paragraph in your essay to explore the way that the techniques in Macbeth have been used. If you have enjoyed this, comment on the video, request more. Hopefully this video gives you an idea of how to use a TEET table, especially if you are doing an exam or an assignment on Macbeth. If you have any requests, please put them in the comments below, and I'll be more than happy to do that for you. Good luck in all of your studies, and don't forget to talk nerdy.